Ireland and New Zealand have a lot in common, except for one thing. Our COVID response was disastrous, while theirs has worked like a charm. Where exactly did our politicians go so wrong? This is Ben Scallan, and you're watching Gript Media. When it comes to COVID and our response to it, rather than just being negative all the time and complaining about the numerous catastrophic errors that the government has made, it can also be useful to look at who got it right so that we can contrast and compare results. Ireland and New Zealand are two great countries to compare for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, our populations are almost identical to the decimal place. We have 4.9 million people while they have 4.8. We're both small island nations. We both rely heavily on overseas tourism for our economies. Ireland makes about 9.3 billion euros a year from tourism, while New Zealand makes about 9.6. We both have a large agricultural sector and many similar exports. We both have a large neighbour that we do business with. In our case, it's Britain, and for the Kiwis, Australia. So there are lots of parallels to be drawn here between Ireland and New Zealand. But one thing that doesn't compare at all is our COVID figures. At the time of writing this video, Ireland has almost 3,000 recorded COVID deaths and growing, and yet how many does New Zealand have with the same population? Do they have 2,000, 1,000? Well, no, actually, to date they have a mere 25 deaths. That's 25 compared to our 3,000. Clearly, something has gone horribly wrong here for Ireland. To make matters worse and really rub salt in our wounds, New Zealand hardly has a lockdown at all. Just look at these photos from a music festival over the weekend. Since June of last year, there have been some mild restrictions in certain regions of the country on and off, but for the most part, aside from the first few months of the pandemic, everything has been open and people in that country have been free to live their lives as normal, and their economy has bounced back in a huge way because of it. So if they didn't use economy-destroying lockdowns to grind their businesses and native industries into dust, then how exactly did they do it? Well, this may or may not come as a shock to you, but they actually controlled their borders early on. Now, I know that's shocking, but try to pick your job off the ground. Take this BBC article from last year explaining how the Kiwis managed it. How did New Zealand become COVID-19 free? On the 2nd of February, a man in the Philippines became the first person outside of China to die of COVID-19. At this point, there were no reported cases in New Zealand, but the next day, the country began banning entry to any foreigner coming from or via China. Any New Zealander returning from China had to isolate for 14 days. As the virus spread globally, a flight ban was also extended to Iran, the origin of New Zealand's first case, and restrictions placed on anyone arriving from South Korea, Northern Italy, or who was showing symptoms. As of midnight on the 16th of March, everybody, including New Zealanders, had to go into self-isolation on arrival in the country unless they were coming from the largely unaffected Pacific Island nations. Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern said that these were the strictest regulations in the world for which she would make no apologies. Then, a few days later, Ms. Ardern took the unprecedented step of closing the borders entirely to almost all non-citizens or residents. Doing this early on with only over a few thousand cases worldwide at the time allowed them to basically stop the influx and stop the community transmission, Professor Martin Burke, an economist at the country's Massey University, told the BBC. Now, is that not just the most incredible thing you've ever heard? Closing the borders early did not let the disease in. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, but if only someone had suggested these ideas to the Irish government early on. Except, of course, people did suggest it. Many people. I was one of them. Ireland and the EU should immediately shut down all travel to and from China over this coronavirus outbreak. Leo Varadkar is both Taoiseach and Minister for Defence. If he does not act swiftly, he will seriously imperil Irish lives. That was from January 26, 2020, exactly 1 year ago, a full month before there was a single case of COVID recorded in the Republic of Ireland. Italy hadn't even gotten bad by that point. And within 3 weeks after the first case landed on our shores, the virus had spread to all counties. It had reached every corner of the island. So we had ample warning to do what New Zealand did, and frankly, the correct response was obvious. And yet, what did Simon Harris say in response when he was health minister?
Where free movement of people is very much at the core of the entire purpose of that union. even if people were in the space of individual countries banning flights, it simply wouldn't work. I mean, people move from one country to the other country to the other country, so Europe needs to act together on all decisions, and Ireland will always act in unison with the European Commission and with the World Health Organization in relation to all of these issues, and our responses have to be proportionate. So we can't avoid people travelling around, people moving around, but we can look at specific high-risk events and give recommendations, but it'll ultimately be up to organisers to decide how to respond.
Free travel is very much at the core purpose of the EU, even when there's a deadly global pandemic taking place. The government were so committed to the European project that they refused to assert our nation's sacred right to border control, even to save Irish lives. And note that line as well. He said our responses have to be proportionate. We can't avoid people travelling around, people moving around. Unless, of course, you're an Irish citizen apparently, and you want to travel 5 kilometres within your own country. And remember, 5 kilometres was the extended distance. It was originally only 2. And now they're talking about going back to that again. So banning you from travelling to the next county within your own nation isn't disproportionate, but closing the borders is. We let in plane loads of infected Italians while that country was being ravaged by COVID in March. Around that same time, we invited 1,000 people in from infected regions for an alcohol policy convention. We let the Cheltenham crowds in for days, and at least 10 of those who entered turned out to be infected. There was the Bulgarian strawberry pickers thing with Keelings and about 1,000 other examples. And then they have the audacity to act shocked and gobsmacked that the country is suddenly full of COVID. We all could have seen this coming. Anybody with a modicum of common sense was warning about this since January when the disease first came to our attention, and then to top it all off, they still haven't learned their lesson. Leo Varadkar recently said that mandatory quarantine at the border will be disproportionate and go against the EU's spirit of free movement. As seen in the Irish Examiner, a system of mandatory quarantine for incoming air and sea passengers would be disproportionate and unworkable, Tánaiste Leo Varadkar has said. Bear in mind, putting the entire country under house arrest and banning you from travelling within your own country isn't disproportionate or unworkable. Destroying hundreds of thousands of jobs and driving up the national debt isn't unworkable. Just controlling our country's borders. That's a step too far. Everything else that's going on right now is totally fine. Responding to questions from Social Democrats co-leader Catherine Murphy, Mr. Varadkar said that Ireland has seen a near total collapse in incoming foreign travel to just 33,000 people per week, with the majority of these people having undertaken what he called essential travel. Ms. Murphy said that data given to her indicated that 49% of incoming passengers failed to comply with the passenger locator form. So he says that incoming foreign travel has collapsed to a new low of 33,000 people a week entering the country. That's the low figure. I'd very much like to know what it was before. And bear in mind, none of these people are being quarantined, and according to Catherine Murphy, half of them are not complying with the passenger locator form, so we haven't a clue if they have COVID or where they go next once they arrive. He said such measures would be disproportionate as people already living here who are COVID positive would not be subject to such a quarantine. He also cited the EU's clear rules on the freedom of movement, there's that word again, as a reason not to do it. So here we are, a full year later, and they have learned absolutely nothing. There is even this new highly infectious Brazilian variant, and we're still after letting in over 1,500 people from Brazil in 2 weeks. Anthony Staines, professor of health systems in DCU, has warned that the Brazilian strain of the virus will inevitably reach Ireland's shores. He said that new variants, which have made the virus more transmissible, would likely mean the spikes and outbreaks occurring even faster than before. He told the Irish Sun, "It is absolutely inevitable, but at some point somebody will wind up in Ireland with the Brazilian virus. And that's not the end of the world if we're controlling the infection, but if the virus is running around the country unimpeded, it's the makings of a disaster, a real disaster, because we don't know a lot about this strain." He says it's inevitable, but it's only inevitable if our leaders continue to act like complacent buffoons and allow it to happen. So far, they have made the most feeble attempt to actually stop the virus from arriving here in the first place because of their love affair with the EU, globalism, and open borders. This is the definition of a failed experiment if there ever was one. Right now, we're relying on a PCR test result at the border, which Tony Holohan, the Chief Medical Officer, has already said will fail to detect up to 40% of cases. So in other words, if 10 people enter, 4 of them who initially tested negative may still have the virus and spread it within our country. That is simply unacceptable. Ireland must seal its borders or face repeated lockdowns into 2022, expert says. Microbiologist Professor James McIerney has warned that unless Ireland seals its borders and introduces rigorous quarantine measures, there will be repeated lockdowns for the remainder of the year and maybe even into 2022. I was calling to close the border on January 26th, 2020, and exactly 1 year later to the day, I'm calling to close the border on January 26th, 2021. We have lost a year and close to 3,000 people have died for nothing. We're on an island, we're surrounded by ocean and have complete control over our ports and entryways. For the love of God, can we assert that control before continuing with another year of this poxy lockdown? Can someone, anyone in charge, please use their brains for once? Please like and share this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider signing up for a monthly donation via the link on screen to help us produce more content like this. Alternative media like Gript needs all the assistance it can get, and every donation goes a long way. As always, thanks for watching.